Williams, break down barriers. Spirit of life, come to us to break down barriers, to widen horizons, to make us less judgmental. Help us to see the larger picture and the kinder conclusion, to love and let live, to embrace and forgive, to sustain and care. Help us to reach out to our better selves, that we may love more and hate less, care more and reject less, that bound together by understanding, we may sustain each other through trial and tribulation, through joy and happiness, through sickness and in health. Help to guide us by forgiveness and compassion. And give me just a minute to move the computer over to where Nancy is so we can hear and see her. Oh, Ian's going to do that. Thank you, Ian. That was extremely lovely. Thank you so much. What a great way to start us off this morning, Nancy. So next we have Chalice Lighting. And the reading for the Chalice Lighting this morning is called For Every Time We Make a Mistake by the Reverend Maureen Killoran. For every time we make a mistake and decide to forgive ourselves, we light this chalice. For every time we are lonely and let someone be our friend, we light this chalice. For every time we are disappointed and we choose hope, we light this chalice. And now again, as usual, I would like to invite any of you to share a joy or a concern, and we will light a candle here, and you may want to light one in your house as well.
Catherine asked me to have you light a candle for her brother Tom, who died this week. And I would also like to light a candle for a friend of mine and family, who also lost his life this week. Craig was his name.
Thank you for sharing. We're sorry about the losses, of course.
I'll light a candle just for the joy of having gotten fully vaccinated. And many of us who work at the school district, are now all fully vaccinated and should be good to go. So.
I think we're beginning to see the light at the end of this tunnel, and it's not a train coming towards us. Okay.
Yeah, speaking of that, could we light a candle for the relief package that was just passed and all the money that would be going into people that really need it, and hopefully it's the last one that our country needs to do, and hopefully it will help those that need it the most.
Yes, thank you, Shannon. Any other joys or concerns to share this morning, please?
I'd like to light a candle for hope that the new voting bill gets through the Congress.
Yes, in keeping with our fifth principle about democracy. And we'll light one final candle for joys or concerns unspoken but felt in the heart. Are there any children present? I don't think so.
Bruce is.
Oh, Bruce, okay. Thank you, Bruce. I appreciate your devotion to that. So anyway, this is a story, and it may be a little more for adults than for children. It's called The Dervish in the Ditch. It's a short story. Once a dervish holy man and his student were walking down a long, quiet road. Suddenly, they saw dust rising in the distance. A fine carriage pulled by 6 horses approached at full gallop. The men soon realized that this carriage was not going to slow down or veer to avoid them. In fact, it was coming upon them at such speed that they had to throw themselves from the road, landing quite unceremoniously in a ditch. The 2 men got up quickly as they could and looked back at the carriage as it sped by. The student thought to curse, but not before the teacher ran after the carriage, calling, "May all of your deepest desires be satisfied." "Why would you wish something so good for those men?" asked the student. "They just forced us into the ditch. We could have been hurt." "Do you really think," replied the teacher, "that if their deepest desires were satisfied, they would go around treating others as they treated us. And now we'll turn to our moment of silent reflection or meditation, or whatever word you prefer. And this is called Be Here This Moment by Chip Rausch. We are about to enter sacred time. We are about to make this time and this place sacred by our presence and intention. I invite us to turn down the volume on our fears and to loosen the armor around our hearts. Do it as slowly as you need to. If you take a little risk with good people, you may find that they have the same human needs as you do. Take a deep breath. Let go of the expectations placed on you by others and those they taught you to place on yourself. Drop the guilt and the shame, not to shirk accountability, but an honest expectation of the possibility of forgiveness. Let go of the thing you said the other day. Let go of the dread that you're thinking about next week. Be here in this moment. Breathe here. Interesting. We might do, Victor. Let's just play the sound.
Oh, that's okay. Slight technical difficulties. Well, good morning. I've titled my talk Forgiveness in a Wild World. And I hope the reason that I've done so is clear by the time I'm finished at least. Alexander Pope wrote in his essay on criticism, "To err is human, to forgive divine." The quote is from a sweeping work written in verse on the pitfalls of literary criticism and the qualities of what Pope saw as good writing. Outside of a university English department, I will wager that very few people know any of the rest of the 500 odd lines from Pope's essay on criticism. And yet this one phrase, this single line, resonates in the consciousness of the English-speaking world. To err is human, to forgive divine. It feeds upon the cultural credence we unquestioningly give it. There are suppositions underpinning this line. There is a dichotomy at work here. What is human as opposed to what is divine? I want to break down this dichotomy between the human and the divine in order to move toward a more universal understanding of forgiveness. To do so, I intend to plumb the depths of our past. I want to explore the development of culture and find the wild source of our humanity. A customary view of the human world is one which separates our species from the wild. The human world is thought of as a realm of domestication, distinct from the wild outside of our control. Now here is another dichotomy, the wild as opposed to the domesticated. To dissolve one dichotomy, we perhaps must dissolve the other as well. We're deconstructing the great chain of being from the Middle Ages. So this is a sort of a picture created by Aquinas, I think, among others, of lower to higher forms of being. So it placed all things into a hierarchy. Some minerals like lead were seen as lower, and some like gold were seen as higher. Some plants like moss were seen as lower, and some like the oak tree were higher. Some animals were lower and some higher. Some people lower and some higher. Some spirits lower and some higher, with God reigning over all. Enlightenment thinkers reimagined this hierarchical paradigm as they fashioned their belief that higher forms of life developed out of lower forms. This type of thinking continues to color popular misconceptions of evolution and how human beings fit into the web of life. Comprehending our evolution as a species brings invaluable insight into the operation of these false dichotomies and the inaccurate distinctions between what are seen as higher and lower forms of being. To see the human world through the lens of the wild is to deeply understand the nature of forgiveness within our human lives. A predatory wild animal is not in need of forgiveness for hunting down another being. For humans, however, forgiveness is essential. It is a fundamental aspect of our relationship with each other and ultimately with reality itself. I say this because forgiveness is an evolved trait. It is a neurosocial pillar of our well-being. Our minds are structured by evolution to operate in concert with other humans. We evolved as successful collaborators, tracking the interplay of the needs and abilities of our fellow primates. An individual's capacity to collaborate and cooperate was limited by the information they had access to, and limited by their ability to integrate their own drive towards self-preservation with their impulse to contribute toward the well-being of the group. There were conflicting feelings within a band of early humans regarding their needs and wants for resources, not to mention conflicting feelings of needs and wants concerning the attention and affection of mates and friends within an ancestral primate band. Forgiveness then is an evolved trait. It is an aspect of our mental lives in which we are able to create a positive psychological framework for mending the wounds caused by the inevitable disappointments stemming from life in a group of highly complex individuals. Forgiveness has evolved as a necessary function of our ability to thrive as a cooperative species. Forgiveness appears as part of the constellation of mental attributes that distinguish human beings from other animals. We have a reflective, conscious understanding of the ways in which we can hurt and be hurt. This knowledge of what is right and wrong for ourselves and others creates an interior experience for human society, necessarily making us different from other animals. Knowledge of good and evil? Here we are again on the familiar ground of original sin. Our separation from the innocence of a wild natural state. Through evolving social complexity, our ancestors developed the capacity to conceptualize right and wrong in an abstract sense. The anxiety that arises as part of mental complexity prompted early humans to form an understanding of the spiritual and to speculate on the activity of supernatural forces within the inexplicable patterns of the natural world. They saw that the spiritual had something to do with right and wrong, and while they could see it at play, a perfect understanding fell somewhat beyond their grasp. Ritual and superstition then formed around the need to react and interact with the spiritual, which is an inherent outgrowth of our evolved ability to conceive of right and wrong. So to know that we err is human, and to realize that we need to forgive is perhaps the most human experience, which is to say, the experience of transcending the limiting confines of the individual self by giving of oneself compassionately for the good of others and even for the good of the world. While I insist that the evolution of compassion and our ability to forgive are the essential aspects of humanity which have propelled our species' success on the planet, the world around us is certainly not a utopia of compassion and forgiveness. Our compassion and collaboration evolved in an ongoing interaction with forces of aggression and competition. Aggression and competition are drives which motivate individuals to assert their dominance within a community. Evolution selected for a balance of cooperative and competitive traits within groups, largely weeding out traits that precluded an individual's ability to cooperate with their band. The traits for aggression and competition, however, have been more strongly selected for as they pertain to the interaction between groups. As one group of hominid primates would strive to territorialize the resources of another band, their ability to cooperate was paired with their aggressive and competitive drives. A tendency toward group competition is an evolved aspect of our social consciousness. Once the planet became widely populated by humans, the tendency toward competition developed socially into political structures of domination. The history of the last short 10,000 years involves the rise of empires, complex forms of political cooperation that are ultimately reliant on exploitation and oppression. How can we forgive ourselves? We need to carry on with the dissolution of the dichotomy between the wild and the domesticated. When I speak of the wild, I mean to evoke the freedom and generative forces of our natural world. The term wild is often defined as that which is outside of human control. Anything that is domestic is something having to do with the home. Anything that is domesticated is something that has been brought under human control. We build walls around ourselves to make a home. We fence in animals to keep them under our control. Domestication is about protection and preservation of vital resources. I argue that the domestic is different from the wild only within the human mind. The world, through wild forces, has created the cell wall, the shell of an egg, and the skin of an animal, all to keep vital resources of an organism safe and whole. Agriculture and empire both involve patterns of containment and control. Humanity only began its outright domestication very recently, in the last 10,000 years. Although these patterns of domestication did build upon the ancient core human traits of cohesion and cooperation, which are rooted in our wild nature. In a real sense, our present day human world is just as much a part of nature as any other aspect of reality. Take manners, for example. Good manners, bad manners. Manners are an example of domestication within human culture. We establish norms for behavior within society, not out of an arbitrary desire to control each other, but from a real need to be able to maintain a collective harmony. The domestic world has diverged from the world of hunter-gatherers, though, in terms of scale. The term domestic pertains both to an individual home and to an entire country. In the process of scaling up the size of human societies, a steep stratification has occurred. The hierarchy of wild, human, and divine in sequence, like that chain of being, right? Wild, human, divine, developed into a chain within human society, where kings were seen as belonging to God or even as gods,
and where the undomesticated peoples living in the wild places were still seen as animals. Rather than manners serving to maintain a unified group cohesion, etiquette was used to distinguish who was in and out of a certain class. We have evolved to be very forgiving toward those who we consider to be part of our in-group. And this fact has been manipulated by a patriarchal system for thousands of years. When the king is seen as a father, we are much more willing to forgive his atrocities. So what do we do to free our wild hearts? Well, I think we have to recognize that domestication is just an idea. We need to see the patterns of exclusion and control operative in our society for the short-sighted lack of imagination that they carry out. We need to acknowledge that the many harms done to the world through greed and selfishness can be set right. And it takes work engaging the world with our capacity to love. This calls us to then forgive ourselves and to forgive each other for all the pain that has been caused. Only then will change come. Thank you.
Sing a song with me. Come sing a song with me. Come sing a song with me, that I might know your mind. And I'll bring you home when home is hard to find. And I'll bring a song of love and a rose in the winter time.
I would like you to all join me in blessing the offering. Oh, now, of course, it's going to leave my mind what exactly to say. Let this be an offering to sustain and strengthen this place, which is so sacred to many of us, a community of memory and hope, for we are the keepers of the dream.
A few closing words and then we'll have discussion. May the power that brings us to life and the spirit that sustains us forgive us for being less than we might be. Guide us to become what is in our power to become in service to others. Send us from this place of worship and time of celebration to live lives of hope, to be nurturers of the vision of wholeness, to serve as healers in this wounded world. All we ask in the name of those to come and in the spirit of those who have gone before. Grant us wisdom, grant us courage, grant us peace, grant us forgiveness.
But I'd love to hear anybody's thoughts or reflections or questions or concerns. Yeah, Victor?
Let's see if there's anybody else first.
I have a real concern. I'd really like to have the words put on the screen because I forget them.
To the song? Yeah,
Yeah.
we had, I'm sorry about that, Bruce. We had some technical difficulties.
I know. It's just, that's my shortcoming.
And I thought for a moment, you know, I could try to hold the hymnal in front of the camera, but then I thought better of that. So.
Yeah. About forgiveness, you know, the quote about forgiveness and that being divine and so on. One of the things that I've always struggled with and continue, I can forgive others a lot more readily than myself. I continue to wonder sometimes, recently in regard to my sister, for example. I don't know what more I could have done, but I always wonder, did I miss something? Could I have done more? Was my timing off? And so on. And I don't know that I did any less than I should have, but sometimes I wonder. And it's hard to think about forgiving what I missed.
I feel you there. I mean, is part of the aspect of that just that we know ourselves so much better? Like we're there for every doubt and misstep that we make. And the sort of out of sight, out of mind thing, you know, you can assume the best about someone else and forgive them because you weren't there for every gritty detail of their process, how they got to where they were. I don't know. I think that, yeah, I'd like to reflect more on that because that does somehow seem key, doesn't it? Because really we can't successfully forgive other people unless we're well ourselves. And we can't be well ourselves if we can't forgive ourselves for our mistakes. So. Yeah, Victor?
Nobody else on the line there?
Not right away, I guess.
So if I heard you correctly, there is a kind of continuum or maybe a dichotomy between compassion on the one end and self-enhancement, aggressive desire for self-preservation on the other. And maybe I missed that, but I thought that you listed several dichotomies, human versus wild. They were higher versus lower, and so on. And I thought, if I heard you correctly, at the most basic level was this desire to be elevated closer to the divine, as if you will, that spiritual dimension that you refer to, versus having these more baser instincts. If I heard that correctly, maybe I didn't, but it seemed like what you were saying is that this dichotomy has existed from before organized civilization. And it's still there now, although it's taken different forms. As empires have established themselves, we still see this dynamic, if you will, played out. Perhaps I misunderstood you, but that's kind of what I thought you were saying.
I think that the core of my idea is that that we shouldn't be assigning ideas of higher or lower to any of our human traits. And that the evolution of our ability to be forgiving is just as natural and part of our emergence from, I shouldn't even say emergence, but part of our evolution as beings on the planet. That aspect of compassion and forgiveness is just as human as our, worries about whether or not we're going to be, fed, or our aggression to assert ourselves.
Yeah.
And that there isn't higher or lower with any of these aspects.
They're both there.
They're both there. They're both human. And the one aspect of my argument isn't about going above or something else being below. And maybe this is what I should have, fleshed out more. But it's the idea that the complexity of the social interaction, how we care for and maintain each other's well-being in a group,
Right.
which involves forgiveness and
Right.
compassion,
Uh-huh.
that is part of the complexity of consciousness, which allows us to transcend ourselves as individuals. And I think that, this is one of those times where the language gets tricky and can easily trip us up. To transcend doesn't necessarily mean to go above. It just means to go beyond. And so it's a beginning of the realization that we aren't just stuck within ourselves, but we're part of something more universal. The walls in between, us as individuals are impermanent, and the sort of on the infinite scale, there's a oneness there. So our ideas that, this is my home, these are my walls, this is my domain, it serves certain selfish interests, but ultimately all of that is swept aside in the scope of time. And what's more eternal is something that we're able to begin to glimpse through the process of forgiveness and compassion, that those selfish things don't matter in the face of a broader oneness, which is more universal, and that's just as real as anything, maybe the
And
most real thing.
And if I got you correctly, those equally real things have been with us even before civilization. And they're still there, perhaps in a different form now. But those two entities, which I understand they have equal valence, one is not higher than the other, they're both part of our humanity, that they've both always been there. Is that correct?
In terms of like a transcendent love and a more like selfish preservation. So Victor's saying those two aspects have both been there all along. And I guess I would say yes. And I think part of my argument is that our ability to care for each other and to work collectively can often be turned against our best interests as a world or as a species, right? So it's this idea of the in-group and the out-group, and our need to belong and our ability to care for each other has been compartmentalized, So this is like why systemic racism keeps perpetuating itself, because we don't see the walls that are built around ourselves because they're only in our minds, right?
Those kinds of walls were there in primitive societies or pre-modern societies, how we want to, the in-group versus the out-group, and placing a premium on preserving the folks that I'm around rather than the folks on the other side of the mountain.
Sure. That the root of that is evolutionary. Yeah. But also the tools that we have to go beyond that are also innately evolved in us. So there's some hope there.
It sounds to me like both the positive and the negative are always part of everything. You don't say the one doesn't exist and the other does. It seems to me for the individual that in dealing with whether or not one has hit the mark or missed the mark in your care and love for self or others, that you try not to slip into self-aggrandizement or into self-flagellation, whether regarding self or the group in which you live. It just seems to me that there's it's all part of a whole, like you're talking about, and maybe the form it takes. Joe suggested the form it takes might be lower on Maslow's hierarchy than it is on the upper reaches. Just a thought. Thank you, Joe.
I'm trying to understand what you mean by the form of it.
How that is expressed, how it's expressed may be different lower on the hierarchy than it is higher. Because, if you think in terms of just self-preservation, how you deal with others is going to change the lower you are on the hierarchy versus life or death or sustenance or moving on up the hierarchy.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. I feel like that's kind of one of the big questions that maybe isn't being asked enough. There's more than enough food being produced on the planet to feed all of the human beings who exist right now. So why are people still hungry? And that's about walls that have been built, sometimes literal physical walls, but more often political walls or cultural walls, and economic walls are a tool of either and both of those forces. So they exist either on paper or in people's minds, but they sure are isolating us from each other in ways that don't help us all thrive. So yeah, to be able to break down that distinction and realize that, you know, the world is one. It's not the human world and the wild world. It's one thing. Maybe that's my argument, that that's a really good first step towards figuring out how to make sure everyone's taken care of. Not just human beings, but all beings.
Thanks.
Yeah, thank you all so much.
I don't know. I couldn't escape the thought during the discussion and during your talk, Ian, that when I think about forgiveness, it's fundamentally a very simple thing for me. It feels good. It feels good on multiple levels and multiple paths, you know, receiving forgiveness and giving forgiveness. It's just a good feeling.
Yeah, right, like a warm hug or something. It's very natural, isn't it? Yeah, I agree with that. And I think that's when I approach this topic, that's something that was kind of lingering in the back of my mind. It's, you know, how can this feel so natural and yet be such a problem?
But I would, you know, I don't want to generalize, but I suspect most people want to be forgiven and want to forgive, and talked
Reasonable assumption.
over the years
Yeah.
about forgiveness. Sometimes it's harder to forgive ourselves than other people, and sometimes we can't forgive other people, but it's just something I think we generally tend to strive to do.
Isn't there something about when your identity, your ego is the thing that is in the way of your ability to forgive someone, right? Like, so it matters to me that I care about this, so I can't let it go. And it's tearing me up inside. Like, I might even in the abstract know I will be better off if I let that go and forgive, but I can't let it go because this is who I am, you know? And I feel like, again, that's about walls that have been built, you know, a home that you've built for yourself. You're domesticated into being this person with this facade and these signs and symbols of who you are. You know, that's your house that you've constructed. And you're not willing to go beyond that, right? So kind of like to carry the metaphor out a little bit. Yeah, Victor?
But what you just said struck a chord with something I heard this morning on NPR. Don Lemon was being interviewed by Lulu whatever Navarro, and anyway, you know, he's an CNN host, right? And he was talking about how Trump and his racist tendencies, and how Trump became so angry with Lemon because Lemon challenged him about that. But that led to a conversation about how hard it is for white people to acknowledge subtle racism because of the ego.
Right.
Because if I acknowledge that I have these racist tendencies, then I have to then feel guilty, and then I have to work on my self-forgiveness. So it's easier for me to say, I'm not a racist. I've never been a racist.
I'm one of the good people.
I'm one of the good people. How
Yeah.
dare you, right?
Right.
So the ego is getting in the way of acknowledging that. I just thought of that in the context of what you were talking about, how our egos can be a limiting factor.
No, absolutely. And I think that's, you know, maybe my call to embrace this spirit of the wild. You know, it's what maybe like Cornel West talks about, the humility that we need to be able to embrace in order to be our best selves, right? We're born out of the funk, and when we die, we rot back into the funk. And there's nothing glamorous about either of the ways that we come into or go out of the world. It's only in our minds that we can construct this, shell, as it were, in which we can pretend that we're above all that. So, yeah.
And I plan to pick up on that idea next week.
Great. We look forward to it. Well, thank you all so much. Have a wonderful
Let's
week.
extinguish the chalice.
Okay.
Got there, yeah.
We extinguish this flame, but not the light of truth, the warmth of community, or the fire of commitment. These we carry in our hearts until we are together again.
Indeed. And then invite people to stick around if they want for the board.
There'll be a board meeting immediately following. So if you're interested at all in putting in your 2 cents, please stick around.
Or just listening.
Or just listening in.
These board meetings are a lot more fun than you might imagine.
That was very thought-provoking.
I have to say, if you don't mind, Victor, Bill, you and your beautiful wife have been